I used to be ashamed of my past and unsure if I'd make it to where I was going. But I knew one thing was for certain. We don't end up where we're going on accident. I've also learned that we can't erase the past or hide from it, but we can learn from it and pass it on to others. So who am I? I'm the definition of a bootstrap girl. Someone who's made the hard choices to pick themselves back up and make something of themselves. And I'm not the only one. My name is Denisha. I'm a mom, a wife, a professor, advocate, queen of my own path, who's overcome abuse, foster care, homelessness, and raising 5 siblings on my own at the age of 24. And eventually I got a PhD. But something that I learned is that I don't know everything. So here on my show, we're going to be bringing in people who know the things that we don't know. Let's get in and learn on the Dr. Denisha Keating Show. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dr. Denisha Keating Show. I am super excited to have the Jonathan on with us. He is a comedian online and just all around awesome person. He does a lot of skits from a church perspective on ministry and has a ton of material on burnout. Within the foster care community, we see a lot of advocates who are asking that question of how do I prevent my burnout from happening, but why am I burning out? And so Jonathan, I reached out and was like, hey, would you come on and talk? And he's like, absolutely. So I'm super excited. And if you'd like, you could just introduce yourself and how did you discover burnout for yourself?
Yeah, so I grew up as a pastor's kid, as a missionary kid in Guatemala. Worked for my dad's church. I saw it start at 75 people after like a massive church split, lawsuit happening, just a lot of mess in
Yeah.
Christianity. And then we kind of got that church healthier, got it larger, and then got a chance to just sort of run my own projects for churches. Throughout all the time, I've just seen, especially pastors, burning out, like, and not just like getting tired, right? Like
Right.
there's like
Right.
like we all burn out. Like there's that like, it's kind of like I equate it to like anxiety, right? Like I feel anxious at times, right? Doesn't mean that I'm like in a downward cycle of anxiety.
Right.
So I've seen, obviously pastors burn out, but like really burn out, like get in that cycle of burnout. And
Yeah.
usually means they're losing their faith, they are going through a moral failure. It's always something really rough that affects a lot of other people whenever that
Yeah.
happens. So me and my writing partner, especially during COVID, we saw it like ramp up a
Yes.
1,000%. Especially again in pastor community where, no matter what decision you made for your church, whether you did masks, did no masks, closed, didn't close, did live stream, didn't live stream,
Yeah.
you were making more than 50% of your church angry. So we
Right.
just
It
saw it.
was
We
like
just saw it was,
constant emails every day, phone calls, text messages, 24/7.
yeah,
It's pretty bad.
and you couldn't, I mean, you still can't make people happy if you mention the C word, right? Like the COVID, like it's
I
gonna,
know.
sorry,
I
that was
I
a weird word
said,
that I could have referenced, but you know what I mean?
you know what? We're here. It's fine.
We're here. We made it.
I
We made it
do.
already. So it's only up from here.
I was like, oh, during COVID, someone's like, can you just say 2020? I was like,
Yeah,
but
it's
okay.
it's a
So
loaded
okay.
it's a loaded situation. Yeah.
So can you explain like the definition of burnout and then some of the symptoms, because I know you said like okay, because I think some people I want you to explain that and then I'll say my next thing, but can you define what the word is and then what it looks like in its entirety?
Yeah. So I mean, again, like I said, burnout. If I'm feeling a sense of burnout, I need to eat a meal. I need to I need to go on
Mm,
vacation. I need to rest. I need, these little things that like, yes, that's good. But like the cycle of burnout is where none of those things seem to be helping. You're just kind of in the spiral where, maybe you get a little bit better and you're immediately back in the pit. That's the difference between, just exhaustion or feeling a little burnt out
mm,
versus you are in burnout. So that's that. How you recognize it is you just you start kind of hating people, because a lot of times, especially in ministry,
mm,
you I mean, this is the you stop being excellent at the basics, those things that like, I mean, I can always
mm,
deliver on this, right? And suddenly those things that are like the basics for you, you stop feeling it, you stop feeling like you're excellent at them.
mm.
um yeah, I mean, those kind of the main things. You start getting really snappy with your family members or with your close relationships. Uh, Burnout is one of those things that like you can't just be burnt out in your work or in your family. It seeps into every area of your life, and it's pretty
Mm.
rough.
It is, and it's like I'm thinking through because sometimes in my brain I'm like, well, how does that lead to like someone who might not know, like, a moral failing is like, okay, they're like cheating on their spouse, or it's like porn, or it's gambling. Like, people are like, I don't understand how that leads to it. It's because the person is trying to find something to fulfill them, so they're chasing some things. It's also, we do see some of the things that I don't think a lot of us consider as like an issue is, you'll start to see someone overeat, or just like they
Mhm.
stop doing stuff, like they'd stop doing their workouts, they stop listening to worship. They'll, like, all of a sudden they're driving up to some music that you're like, wow, you haven't listened to that since I don't know when, and they're just like,
Yeah.
it's not a big deal. And it is the thing to try to find, and like, they're going to an extreme to try to find some pleasure in something, and you might even see them quit. You might see depression raise higher. And I know, especially with pastors, is like suicide starts to go up, because they're just like, what's the point of
Hmm.
this anymore?
Yeah.
So what are some things that you would suggest if someone is like, okay, I'm in burnout, like I am feeling anxious, depressed, I don't want to do this anymore, I thought this was my life
Yeah.
calling, I'm done, like I don't care if I get fired tomorrow, and I don't
Yeah.
want to even, like, that this is the level of where this is a burnout cycle, like it is not something that you just push to the side. Like, how do we start dealing with this?
Yeah, I mean, the bad news, unfortunately, is that you don't suddenly burn out. It's a
Right.
long road to get to burnout. And similarly, it's a long road to get out of burnout.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this feels like such a, when I talk to my wife and she's dealing with anxiety, and I'm like, have you seen your counselor? Like, it feels like such a trite, like almost dismissive. And I don't mean it in a dismissive sense, but
Right.
counseling is vital, because what happens whenever you're going, into that level of burnout is you're just kind of packing these layers of unhealth on your life.
Mm,
And you're packing lies, and you're packing unhealthy behaviors, and you need someone to help you unpack those and kind of shed
yeah.
those layers from your life so you can start seeing clearly. I will say, though, one thing that, if maybe you aren't quite to burnout yet, but you're feeling that, is one of the most liberating things I think that I regularly tell people is you have to remember that, especially if you're in ministry, and if you're, working with foster kids, if you're working in a church, whatever ministry, it doesn't mean that you're like working at a church, right? Like, I'm in
Hmm.
ministry, and we make social media graphics for churches, and I make these little silly videos on Instagram, right? That it is ministry for me, because I'm trying
Right.
to minister to people. So I have to remember that, like, my job is not my ministry. And so often
Mm,
we think I can only minister if it's through this job. But ministry, the gifts and callings of God are without repentance, right? It says that in the scriptures.
mm.
So whether you're working in a ministerial role or you're working at a Starbucks, you can be a minister. So stop feeling trapped in your role, because I think that's so often what happens. We feel trapped, and we feel like, well,
Yeah.
God told me to be a minister, and I have to do that, because otherwise I'm
Yeah.
disobeying God, which is like the worst thing you can do, right?
Yeah.
Your ministry does not depend on your job, and God will use you in whatever capacity. So if you need to take a break, and I think that's sometimes so liberating for people, realizing like, okay, I could actually like take a break for a year. I could go work at a
Yeah.
Starbucks and just like make some coffee and make some friends, right? Like, you can actually do that. That's okay to do that. And you can still be in ministry. It's not a failure.
Yeah.
It's not and so often I think we keep pushing, keep pushing, keep pushing. And then the failure we do have is massive. Whereas if we would have taken a step back and just said, okay, I'm going to take a season of rest here. And, I'm still going to be working. But I'm not going to be working in such a mentally exhausting, and
Yeah.
that might be offensive to baristas who work at Starbucks, who are like, it's mentally exhausting, but you know what I
It
mean? There's
actually
like,
is. So
yeah.
I
So I
worked
mean,
at
maybe a different
Starbucks.
job.
No, I worked at
Sorry.
Starbucks, and it is like, it can be mentally exhausting, because
I
you
believe
see
it.
people before they get their coffee, and they're not nice. They're not
Yeah,
nice.
but there's
But
an
it's the
element of like,
hours
I
and
at
things
least I
like
can
that
shut it
too.
off when I'm done, right? Like, I can
Exactly.
clock out. With
Hmm.
ministry,
You don't.
it's and that's a big part of, I mean, so I wrote this book with my friend Jason, who does a bunch of leadership stuff, and it's called Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright, and we identified 10 pillars of health. Basically, the goal is like,
Hmm.
hopefully we don't even get to burnout, right? Like, if you get to burnout,
Right.
it's a long road to get there. But our idea is that you can be in high capacity leadership ministry and not burn out. You can actually thrive in that. So
Mm.
we identified 10 pillars of health, and one of those is boundaries. And that's so often one of those things that's not available, or
What's
we feel
that?
like it's not available in ministry, right? Like, we can't have
A hundred
boundaries
percent.
because there's this mandate from Jesus to love, right?
Yeah.
Who's the good Samaritan, right? Like, you're in your journey, and then like something interrupts your day, right? Like, he broke through
Right.
his boundaries, right? But there's this idea that we can set boundaries in love, where it's
Mm-hmm.
not pushing people out, but it's choosing the right time when they come in. And
Yeah.
so often in ministry, what we perceive as love is just people that haven't planned ahead, that their life is chaos, so they're inflicting their chaos on you, in a business, in a job capacity. So learning to
Yeah.
set proper boundaries is so vital.
Okay, so someone told me something and I was offended at first, and then I was like, wait, that's actually cool. Is God can still move even when you take a break. God doesn't need you to keep moving. And I was like, but I want him
Yeah.
to want me in this role. But what I found is like with specifically within, so my husband has worked and is working at churches, like that's his, he does ministry in that capacity.
Hmm.
And then I do a lot of foster care with foster parents, like talk to foster parents, talk to foster youth, like talk to caseworkers. And there's a similarity between like a pastor and what I do is that we
Oh
carry the
yeah.
same level of burden of stories. And I
Hmm.
think that can get very exhausting. And someone was like, Denisha, like God can still move in their life, even if you're not the person that's walking right alongside of them. And at first I'm like, but, and then I'm like, wow, like, hold on. That I think where pastors can feel this, we do as advocates as well sometimes, is that it's like, well, our mission, the mission to save someone isn't going to happen if we're not present.
Yeah.
But like you said, we can't, like, if we're in that level of burnout, we're not effective anyway. And so
Yeah.
the boundary, which everyone's like, oh my God, a key word. And I'm like, look, a boundary is actually good because
Yeah.
it's not saying I don't love you. It's actually saying because I love you, because I want to be here long term, I need to set up something where it's, if there is a day off, I'm taking a day off. If it's that I'm not preaching every Sunday or doing this day out, day in and day out, and all of these other things, like I'm taking that step back to be healthy so that I'm here long
Yeah.
term. And I think that that's wild when I started to look at it like you said, like I'm looking, like I am a minister in the area that I'm in. I don't have to be a pastor. I'm not a pastor, but I am a minister in what I do. But those boundaries are so important when I'm
And
feeling
and and you don't have to
go
be the
ahead.
savior. I
Exactly.
think we
Like,
we we
let's not run that
glamorize.
over. Like, we're
Yeah, well,
not the savior.
we glamorize in movies the person who, gets beaten up bloody to save, the trafficking victims, or whatever, whatever in the movie
Yeah.
that this person is trying to
Yeah.
save, they are the savior. And so we think, well, that's what Jesus wants from me. Jesus wants me to be a savior. And guess what? He's the savior.
So in the foster care community, a lot of people will say like, don't have a hero complex,
Hmm.
because the problem with it is it's not that they're not grateful for us stepping in or helping, but what it turns into is because of the level of burnout that we could experience, we actually just stop showing up. And so it's like, oh, you
Yeah.
have the hero complex, you want it to feel good for your ego, and then you're done, you wipe your hands, you walk away. And I think sometimes we don't recognize that it's not that the person's just walking away, it's that they've experienced a ton of burnout with trying
Yeah.
to do too much because they're trying to be the hero in the story. And it's like, maybe that's not the role you need to play, because that role doesn't actually exist. We're not,
Yeah.
like you said, God is the hero and the savior, and that's the only person we need to rely on. So what would be a boundary if I'll give you a scenario that's a little bit different than I think pastor. It's not very much different though. I'm thinking through it, I'm like, it's not that different. So typically people think that a pastor works on Sundays and that's it.
Yeah. Nope.
Same with foster care advocates. They're like, oh, you just worked today and that was it. But most of us work, it never turns off. It's 7 days a week,
Yeah.
24/7, 365 days. I do advocacy online and in person. And some people like to separate that. And I think that that's great for them. I find that there are a lot of people who scroll at night. And so I share little bits and pieces of my story to try to do it from a hope perspective. But that means that I'm not only on in person all day with my job of teaching and working with other people, and some pastors also do a ton of that as well. What are
Yeah.
some boundaries that you would say to the person who is 7 days a week all day long? What could I establish and put in place that would start to help me from the spiral of burnout?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to address also, before we get into that,
Yeah.
scripture talks about loving your neighbor, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
even sacrificial love, right? And in scriptural times, your neighbor was, maybe 15, 20, 30 people, 100 people. And we're
Mm,
in a world where our neighbor is, depending on, potentially 100,000 people who have access to us immediately.
yeah.
So, it's understanding who do I need to impact at this time? So sometimes that means limiting our channels that people can get into us. So
Mm,
limiting ways that people can contact us, not for trying to create a gatekeeper, but kind of saying, this is the way that I can deal with communication right now in a healthy way. So, if they're trying to reach out on Facebook Messenger, Instagram Messenger, email, call, text, WhatsApp, like all the platforms, and so much of that
yeah.
is just exhausting for you. So that's one simple thing, is just if you're trying to make yourself available 24 hours, and I get that, like especially in foster care system where like stuff can come up, at 2
Mm,
a.m. That's often where the worst stuff comes up, right? Like it's like,
yeah.
whenever all logic has gone out of the world. So really setting how you can be communicated with, and then setting times. So again, if you know that like typically stuff arises during this time the most, or the most emergencies arise during this time, set some time
Yeah.
during the day that you're like, hey, I'm offline. Like
Blocked out.
you can
Yeah.
rearrange your schedule and say, I don't, obviously this can't be an 8 to 5 job, but sometimes we do an 8 to 5 job plus the 24 hours, right? And
Yeah.
maybe that eight
Yeah.
to five job is actually our time of rest, whereas the rest of the time. So I mean, if that's what you feel called to do, there's ways of doing that. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is the key is letting the emergencies come in. But if emergencies are regularly occurring, if that's the
Yeah.
norm instead of the exception, then it's time to set a boundary, right? Like
Yeah.
emergencies are okay. Like I do, like, I mean, I'm in from 8 to 5, but like something comes up and it's like 10 p.m. Oh, I need to fix this right now. I can
Yeah.
deal with that emergency, but that's not every day, every week, or whatever. It's not a
Yeah.
regularly occurring thing.
So there was, I forget who it was, but I remember my husband telling me something about, I think it was a pastor, but he would always be like, he would have a day that was planned for him to go off to Disneyland with his family because he lived in California. And
Yeah,
he would be like, "You want a meeting with me? You have to come to Disneyland." So, and at first I was like, "That doesn't matter if you have like an annual pass." And I was like, "Oh my gosh. Like if you don't have an annual pass, like that meant that they had to like pay to get in." And then like
yeah,
he'd be like, "You got an hour." But he would put these boundaries down and say like, if this is really that important, this is what this
hmm,
means, is that you have to do XYZ to get here and then pay. And not to be, it's not to be rude to be like, well, you have to pay to get access to me, but it was like, hey, if it's an emergency that can't wait to when my calendar is open,
yeah,
then this is the route that you have to go. But it is
yeah,
so crazy. I love that you said reduce the channels, because in my head, like as an entrepreneur, so many people are like, you have to be on everything and all the things. Like you have to be on YouTube,
yeah,
Instagram. So I just take the same content and I put it on all of them because I'm like, I don't have time for this.
yeah,
Like, and it's like I want to reach people in that, but really, when I start to look at it in it, like I'm like, okay, I'm giving 10 ways to give someone access to me. I
yeah,
have seen an uptick when people are experiencing anxiety. They feel like their situation is an emergency, and normally it's not. It's
yeah,
just that they're feeling like it's an emergency. But I'll get the text message, then the phone call, then the email, then the Facebook
yeah,
message, then the Instagram message, and it's all the same person. And it's
yeah,
not different people, but it's the same person being like, I need you now. And it,
yeah,
it can be very exhausting. So how can we, if we're in that situation with someone who's doing this repeatedly, how
yeah,
can we set a boundary that's healthy with them to say one channel, but also like not, and this might come across rude to somebody, but your emergency may not be my urgency. So giving some
yeah,
grace to say, if it's not life or death, like if it's someone literally not dying and it can wait till
yeah,
morning, how can I have that kind of, that's a hard conversation. But I have seen it with pastors and I've seen it within the foster care community where it's like, that's not an emergency at all. Like
yeah,
you're upset over something, and now you've resorted to 5 channels to message me in panic, and then
yeah.
you're upset that I didn't answer. What would be the guidance there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a really cool feature on your phone, Do Not Disturb,
Oh, I love that
and
one.
yeah, but I mean,
Oh, I
it's
love
it's
it.
it's worth it's worth telling a person, these 6 channels I check between this time and this time. I don't get
Yeah.
notifications, so if you reach out to me, I will not see it. And
Mm.
for your sake, do that. Because sometimes I know people say that like, oh,
Yes.
I didn't see the notification. You saw the notification. I'm seeing notifications pop up right now, right?
Mine's on Do Not
Actually turn off,
Disturb.
but actually turn off those channels and then have one
Yeah.
channel where it's an emergency. And then it's just a matter of saying, hey, real quickly, what is this about? I'm sorry, that's an emergency. I'll be available. Because and along with that, I think it's vital to, again, we're talking about kind of the savior complex or the hero complex,
Yeah.
is humble yourself enough to say, for my sake, for my survival, I need
Yeah.
this. It's not a matter of I don't care, I do care, but I have a lot of people reaching out to me, and if I'm going to be able to keep helping you, I need this boundary for myself. It's not attacking them because again, they're in fight or flight mode. They're in panic mode. They're
Right.
like
Right.
they feel like they're going to die. When anxiety's in the mix, man,
Mm-hmm.
it
It's a whole new
feels
world.
real. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not a matter of like them being like irrational. I mean, it is irrational, but it's like it's in my head. It's real.
It
Like it's real to
feels
me. I'm
like we're
seeing it.
dying. It 100%
Yeah,
feels like we're
yeah.
like, well, no, no, I'm not dying, but it feels like that's the next step. And you're like,
The
it's
cortisol in your
wild.
body is telling you that you are dying. It's a chemical thing
Yes.
that your body's like, you are dying. You need help right now. So realizing that like it's not them being evil, it's not them being bad. And I think that sometimes what happens is like, oh my gosh, you get this kind of like anger for them, and
Yeah.
you say you need to stop this, but instead
Yeah.
saying taking the ownership of like, I can't do this, and I'm so sorry. And there is
Yeah.
someone that is available during the times that I'm not available. If you reach out to them, they will, cost more money or whatever, right? But like give them resources if it is that. But yeah, really just humbling yourself and saying, I can't do this. I'm not as strong as you think I am.
And I think that might come across as someone being like, well, that's weak. It's like, it's actually not, because I think that's where
Well,
what
be
I've
weak. You are
learned,
weak.
we
It's
we're
okay. That's the
it's
humbling part.
we're human. And
Yeah.
it's not that, like, when we think like weak, it's like, okay, I can't lift boxes, so I'm going to ask somebody else for help. Like, I can't
Hmm.
lift over 30 pounds. My daughter is 2 year old, just turned 2, and she's heavy, and sometimes I have to pass her off to my husband because I'm like, my arms aren't like,
Yeah.
and but then when it's like, well, I have to carry the world, it's like, no, that was never our responsibility to do. And we have to share with that with other people, because also we can't be their only person in the world. People are still
Yeah.
going to need you. Whoever is listening to this, like, people are still going to need you, but we can't need you in a way that it's nobody else can be there. Like, I've seen it too,
Yeah.
where it's an unhealthy amount, where it's like, if you're not available, we've see this extreme where it's like, if you're not available right now, I might end my life. And it's like, okay, we didn't get to this level with this person all of a sudden. This
Yeah.
was that we didn't establish and say, hey, from the times of this to this, I will not answer because I'm with my family. I will
Yeah.
not answer. Like, I have my you can also, just so you guys know, is on Do Not Disturb, you can set times. So I have it
Hmm.
on automatically go at 9 o'clock at night, and it does not come back on until 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm up at some of those points, but turning it
Yeah.
off where it's automatic, I started doing that during COVID, because I like, it was wild. And I just felt the anxiety. You can turn off your notifications for apps as well. You can set those
Hmm.
different times during your lunchtime. You can literally put
And
these
you
little
can set
breaks
the
everywhere.
emergency one where like phone
Yeah.
gets through or this number gets through. You can set the
It's like,
exceptions.
if I have mine where it's like, if 2 or more times the person calls, it will let it come through. But
Yeah.
people who know that have been like, I'll just keep calling. And I remember one situation where it was a student I was working with, and they called me at 2 o'clock in the morning, and my daughter was like 6 months, and I
Ugh.
just got to sleep. And I'm getting this call, and I answer thinking it's my brother, because my brother had something going on that day, and he's like, I'm having car problems. So he's like super stressed. So I'm like, call me if you need me. And this call came through, and the person was upset and was like, I just got this, and da 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 da. And I was like, I'm so sorry, who is this? And, oh,
Yeah.
it's me. And I was like, I looked at the time, I'm like, it's 2:30 in the morning, and this is not an emergency. Let's talk tomorrow. And they said, it's an emergency to me, it's life or
Yeah.
death to me. And I said, we will need to talk in the morning, because this is not, I understand you feel this, but this is not okay. And
Yeah.
this I work with a lot of students where I teach and I do doctoral coaching for their programs. So there are moments where it literally is, if they don't pass this thing, they don't move forward and they don't get the degree. And in our head, we go, and then I don't finish, and then I don't get the job that I need,
Yeah.
and I spent all this money, and we spiral. And
You
so
start
I've
fortune telling of all the things that are going to
it's
happen.
and
Yeah.
it's so heavy, and I've been there. But what I have had to do is say, I understand that you're stressed, but we actually, for your health, I've actually had conversations where I'm not like, let's plug through this. You're feeling the weight of the world. I'm like, hey, let's take a break. Let's move your appointment to later, because right now you're not even hearing me at this point.
Yeah.
I see it in your eyes. And I've helped, hopefully helped a few people go from panic to like, okay, let's plan. But when you're in
Hmm.
panic brain, you can't think that far. And
Yeah.
it is heartbreaking to watch when someone spirals into this. But we do this as pastors and as people who are advocates as well. Is we're like, well, if we don't help, then we don't get the next job, and then we don't get the next speaking event, and then we what like then what good are we?
Yeah,
And it's
or
like,
even not even from, even just from a purely altruistic, like
yeah,
you want to help this person, and you do
yeah,
know that,
very
like,
simple, yeah.
if they don't get this resolved, they're not going to sleep tonight, and then that's going to cause more anxiety tomorrow, and that's, I mean, the
And it's going
patterns,
to
right? Like,
spiral
so.
into that, and it's like, hold
Hmm.
on, hold on. We are not the only person in their life that can
Yeah.
help,
Well, and
though.
we get trapped in the whirlwind with them
Yes,
of, now
yes,
I'm
oh my
speaking into
gosh.
their anxiety with your anxiety, instead of having that outside perspective of like, no, this is going to be okay.
It's crazy. And I keep thinking of have you seen Inside Out 2 yet?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so there's a
I have
scene
a 3-year-old, so I'm trying to get him to see Inside Out
look.
1, and then we'll get there. So.
So in Inside Out 2, and some people were like, it was so emotional. And I was like, I have no emotions. And I was like, just nothing. But there was this scene, and I need to watch it again when I'm not working. I think that's the problem. There's this scene where there's anxiety is introduced to this girl's life, and there's a panel of emotions, because that's where they all sit, is at this big panel,
Hmm.
and anxiety took over. And anxiety, there's this moment where anxiety is standing at the controls, completely frozen, but then around her is herself spinning. And so all you see is red coming around. This is what it looks like when you've gone too far. Your
Yeah.
anxiety is all over the place, depression, panic, self-loathing, like all of these things. And it's like, when we get to this part, it's really hard to find the joy. And that was this
Yeah.
moment where it's like, look how much harder joy has to fight to get to the middle, to say we can breathe. So
Yeah.
when we are in it, I've seen people quit at this point. I've seen people be like, this is, I'm done, I'm over it, and they don't want to go back. But I've seen the tension in the relationships tend to happen from a pastor's point of view or an advocate's point of view. And it's almost like, just I feel the worst part of who we are comes out, and sometimes that's not intentional, but it is reality. So if we have pushed past burnout, pushed past burning relationships, what is the first step to come back to just focusing on healing internally?
Yeah.
Because I meant
That's
it's
a
a big
tough one.
one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of, you acknowledge that I have let myself get
Mm.
to burnout. I think,
Because it's
we
easy to
so
point the
often.
finger. Yeah,
Yeah, we do. And
yeah,
there, there's a reality of other people's involvement.
right.
They didn't respect boundaries that I wasn't very good at maintaining.
Mm.
They criticized me so much. And I let that affect my ego, because I had my ego tied to it, and my
Yeah.
perfectionism, this notion of feeling perfect. Um, so acknowledging, I think, our part in the process of, where
Mm-hmm.
did I let myself get to this place? Because
Mm-hmm.
there is, I mean, there are people who last in ministry with the same, horrible sheep that are trying to, like, knock down their boundaries, and,
Yeah.
criticizing, and, there are people who survive, right? So there
Right.
is a personal responsibility you have to take, not to, point the fingers at you. If you're going through burnout right now, I get it. Like, it's not like you're a
Yeah.
bad person for letting yourself get burnt out, but you do need to
No.
acknowledge
Yeah.
where you let yourself get burnt out, and then start working toward health in that area. So, did you have bad boundaries? Did you have this notion of perfectionism where you had to be the hero, and you had to be the perfect, you know, strong tower that people could run into and be safe, right?
Yeah.
Did you operate from a misplaced sense of values, where you were
Mm.
valuing, you know, getting the national platform or valuing,
Yeah.
getting the clout online versus
Yeah.
actually helping people. So, and there's 10 of them. There's actually this quiz online. It's like a free quiz on don'tburnoutburnbright.com. It's an assessment that kind of, if you fill
Oh,
it out, it'll tell you it's geared primarily toward ministry. So
that's
if you're
okay.
working, yeah, so I
Yeah.
think it'll tell you where kind of your main, hopefully, ideally you should take this before your burnout. It's where you're
Yeah.
most prone to burning out. And it
I need
addresses
to
those
take
10
that.
topics. Yeah.
I don't care if it's ministry related, because what I find is that I really do feel like what I do is on the same level of pastor, just in a different way.
Oh,
Not,
yeah.
and again, I'm not a pastor. I just want to plug that in. But it is the level of like when I look at what a pastor's role is, I'm like, I'm doing all of those things in the foster care world.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then, which is why I actually, one of the things that I've done is like, I don't tell my details of my journey of abuse, because like I'll allude to it and just be like, hey, this is kind of what happened, but I won't go into the details of my story in most situations, because it makes me spiral, but it also makes
Mm,
everybody in the room spiral, and that doesn't help. It's the same word like when we say the word COVID and people are like, don't say that.
yeah.
It's like because it's
It's a
caused them to
trigger word for all of us.
spiral,
Yeah.
and it's I'm just trying to be cautious of that. But I find that there are not a lot of things that are out there for someone that does what I do. So there's not a lot of support. There's not a lot of people who've gone before me. And so that's where it's like, well, I'm the only one doing this. And we do get to a point where we're like, well, I'm the only one who cares enough.
Yeah.
And I've heard that when a pastor says it, I'm like, I knew it. We are on the
It's the
same
same.
level. And
No,
it
I mean,
is
I've met
insane.
pastors who work at restaurants, who work at Starbucks. Like, you can be a pastor no matter what role you're in, because you're just, I mean, you think you're
Exactly.
a shepherd, you're taking care of
Yes.
sheep, right? Like,
But
not to degrade the people you're taking care of, but you're
no.
taking care of people.
And that I think that when we start to look at it that way, it's like, oh, okay, I hate my job. And it's like, okay, do you hate your job, or are you burned out? Like,
Yeah.
what's going on? Like, what's our focus? And I do think that there is an ego at play sometimes. And I think sometimes it's like, well, I want this so much, it's not working out the way I thought it was going to look. And it
Yeah.
like we have to be honest with ourselves, because without honesty, we're never going to get anywhere with it. It's not about
100%.
pointing. I've also seen the opposite, where it's like, well, I would feel better if I just get this. And it's like, that's a thing of contentment. Like, are you content with where you're at? Yes or no? And it's like, no. Okay. Let's start working
Yeah.
on that. But I wanna take this just to see where I'm at too, because I think we can see the translation over with the ministry work that we all do differently. And there's gonna be some things that are a little bit different. But what when it comes to just kind of, I mean, I want to prevent the burnout for anybody who's watching, but I'm like, I feel like there are so many people that I've talked to who are like, Didisha, I'm done. Like, I don't know if I
Yeah.
want to keep doing this. I feel like I hear the term a lot of like, I feel like I'm aged out, not aged out. Like basically they're too old to do what they're doing, that they're,
Mm.
um,
Like, I don't have the stamina for that anymore,
yeah, the
but based on what
stamina's
it does
not
to my
there,
body.
but they also are just like, I'm just too old for this, and like I'm not
Yeah.
relevant anymore. And I know as pastors get older, I've heard them say the same thing, where
Yeah.
they're like, I'm the old dude now in the room. And I'm like, but you have this wisdom that you can still give. That wisdom didn't go away because you aged. But
Yeah.
what we look at it and we're like, well, we're not young and hip anymore. We're not relevant anymore. We're not this anymore. And I feel like that is a level of just like self-doubt then that could lead to like making some really poor decisions. And sometimes it's little things like dyeing our hair, way where we're like,
Yeah.
hey, we see the gray is good, leave the gray,
Yeah.
leave the gray alone. But then we do other things where it's like, okay, let me try this fad diet to try to do this, let me try to change my clothes, let me go buy a new car, let me go do these things that tend to be where it's like, slow down, friend. Like, I'm starting to recognize that. So when you, because you've been a pastor's kid, you've been in the church a long time, is it, be honest, is it easy to see someone when you are like from the outside? Because I think sometimes we go, nobody can see this, it's just me. Can you see it in somebody when you start to talk to them?
Oh, yeah. You mean burnout, or you're talking about the feeling of irrelevance?
Both.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see burnout. There's just a lack of light in their eyes, usually a lot of
Ooh.
sighing.
Oh.
There's kind of this like
Jonathan's
there's
like,
kind of
I've
this
been
hope.
needing to talk to you. Like, shoot. Just
No,
kidding.
there's kind of this hopelessness where you're like,
Yeah.
kind of like, well, that's where it is. Like, it's kind of like it's kind of everything is
Yeah.
you qualify it as like that. Well, that's life. So I mean, I've definitely
A
seen that.
shrug of
I've
the
also seen
shoulders, all, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've also seen the irrelevance thing though, where um I think what needs to happen is you don't need to be the person who relates to the cultures as much anymore. You need to be the one who can respect and honor the culture and learn from the culture. And I
Mm.
think that's a shift people need to make as they age up or age out, whatever they feel like they're doing.
Yeah.
Is, I'm an older millennial and I'm talking to a lot of Gen Z and I'm probably going to be talking to Gen Alpha. And the idea is I don't need to do what they're doing. I don't need to
No,
say
right,
skibbity
right.
toilet riz, right? Like I
What?
don't need to do that. It's the
What
Gen
does that
Alpha, it's what
mean?
I don't know, but I don't need to do that. But I
I
can
throw it
also
away.
at the same
If
time,
it's a bad word, hold on. I'm a millennial.
no,
I'm
it's not a bad word.
probably
It's not a bad word.
okay. I was like, if it's a bad word, we're sorry, Jonathan.
No, no, it's just it's a term, and it doesn't necessarily have a meaning anymore. But it's just something that
Oh,
this
okay.
generation says. Anyways, but I can at the same time I can seek to learn and appreciate that
Yeah.
maybe that's not something I would enjoy in my life is saying that term or making that part of my life, but I can also appreciate it and learn and ask questions. And so there's the reality of like we all are scared of like teenagers or like as you get older you get scared of teenagers, right? But like teenagers actually want someone old to be like, dude, I see
Knock it
something in you. I
off.
see value
Hey,
in you.
let
No,
yeah.
no, well that, but I mean also
There's
just I
that, but
see
then
value
there's
in
the
you.
pour into you. Yeah. Here's
Yeah,
your
I see
mission. Here's
value
your
in you, and I
purpose.
because I think that's a lot of it is we think that they're rejecting us, so we kind of reject them too, and that's
Yeah.
how the younger generations feel. They feel rejected by the older generations
Yeah.
instead of saying, hey, I see value in you. I think you could rock and roll at what you're doing. Every young person wants to hear that from an old person, even if they'll never admit it. We all want to see
Yeah.
see validation from the people older than us. So
Yeah.
changing your perspective of how am I ministering to this generation now? It's no longer, I'm right alongside you using the same slang as
Yeah.
you, but
Yeah.
instead I see value in you and I'm investing in you.
I really like that because I do think that just in every community there, it doesn't feel good to get old. I mean, I'm
No.
like waking up, I'm like, man, I'm sore and I don't know. Is it because I picked up the sock off the floor yesterday or washed the
Your
dishes?
bed was
I
two
don't know.
centimeters out of alignment from usual.
It's rough. I've also
Your
had
pillow,
like
I mean.
back problems since I was 20. So I'm kind of like, this isn't really that new, but it's just, it feels different. And I turned 35 this year and I was like, woo, that's crazy. I never thought I'd get over 18. But then I'm like, oh, I am way over 18. But when you sit with anyone, and it's so beautiful because when you sit with someone, I think sometimes we try to think like, well, I have to provide you wisdom. And that's not always the case, is that sometimes who we're sitting with is going to provide us wisdom. And that
Yeah.
youthfulness can be really good, is we don't need to run over walls and do parkour with them if that's still a thing. But what we can do is we can learn from them and validate, like, hey, you do have this gifting, you do have this
Yeah.
purpose in your life. It's not always about me entering in the room. But I think that there are times when I come in and I'm like, if I don't provide the most value, if I don't say the most wise thing, if I'm not
Yeah.
saying the cool word to be relevant, um, then what am I offering? And it's like, you're offering the wisdom of life, like what you have
Yeah.
lived through. How many more people could we reach if we just listened? Like, just
And
sometimes
honestly, yeah.
validating them.
Yeah, honestly, the most valuable thing you can provide often as a counselor, as a pastor, and the thing that is universal across cultures, across generations,
Mm-hmm.
across languages is empathy.
Mm.
Like, I hear you, I can relate to what you're saying, I understand you. Now let's move from there. Because so
Yeah.
often I think that's what happens when we get older is we're like, let's go straight to the wisdom. I'm going to give you
Mm.
wisdom. When you're younger, you do like the empathy is automatically there because you're like, oh, I
But as
get
you
you.
get
We're in the
older,
same
it like
boat,
goes
right?
away.
As you get older, I feel like you kind of were relying on that like built-in apathy or
Yeah.
sorry, empathy of like, oh, they're my age, they get it, right? But now they don't
Yeah.
get it, they're older. But when you can take time to listen, repeat back, I hear you saying this. Yeah. Oh, I feel
Yeah.
I felt that. So then you've created that empathy, and then you can provide that wisdom, and you can still be relevant.
And I think one of the things too is when we're in that conversation, reminding ourselves that we might not be able to fix it, but just being the person who listens is good. And I ended up taking my siblings in when I was 25. I took in 5 of them, 24 and then took them in. But I recently sat down with a couple of younger adults who were 18, 19 and 20. And was literally, we just sat at a table and we just sat there. And one of the young gentlemen shared like, I'm considering taking my sibling in, and I just said, where are you at mentally, emotionally, financially? And he's like, not very well off. And we sat here and just kind of talked through this, but then we sat in silence. All 4 of us just sat there for a second. And I'm like, I don't think right now is the time for you to take them in. And he's like, I think you're right. But there was not a lot of words. And I
Hmm.
said, I was like, it's okay that there's not a lot of words. And he's like, I'm actually just glad to be sitting with someone who gets it. And
Yeah.
I like sat down and I was like, that was the best conversation. There was not a lot of words, but it was the best
Yeah.
conversation because it gave him time to process with someone who also has gone through that. And it made
Yeah.
me sit back and like, there literally was not like someone else sitting there was just like, you guys barely talked about anything, but it helped him figure out the next 5 years. And I
The
was like, I
crazy
know
thing,
that was weird, but it was not
yeah,
weird. It was just like,
the
whoa.
no, it's the crazy thing about empathy is empathy in and of itself helps people get perspective.
Yeah.
Like it helps them remove themselves from the situation, just knowing I'm not alone in this. Because that
Yeah.
is what happens. We're in that tornado. I'm the only one getting spun around in this. And
Yeah.
when you see someone else that like, I get it, I get it, it pulls them out of that tornado. They can start seeing things clearly. It's like so I mean that's what I hear all the time. Like I make these videos on Instagram.
Yeah.
Really, it's about relatable. Like I get what you're going through, right? And people have, and this is so cringy, but they've said your memes have healed me, which is absurd, right? But the idea is they realized that I got what they were going through, and it
Yeah.
gave them perspective. That empathy gave them perspective, and it
Yeah.
helped them heal themselves, right? Like they realized, oh yeah, like I see that clearly now.
Yeah.
So yeah, empathy is huge.
And it's so funny that we can do something so small for like 4 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds online and someone goes, "Wow, I finally feel like someone gets it." And
Hmm.
that I think is wild to me because it's
Yeah.
just like there's nobody in your vicinity. This is where the internet is so cool. There's no one in the physical vicinity that's going, no, you're absolutely validated in this. It took
Yeah.
some random person on the internet that put a reel out there, but then you also said earlier, you're like, hey, I need to set my boundary here so I'm not available
Yeah.
24/7. So it's like you can make a difference online in a very the internet can be very dark, but it can also be
Oh,
really
yeah.
fun, really humorous. And like I've been following, I don't know how long. I think 2020 is when I started to follow you. If you were,
Oh,
I'm
wow.
pretty sure, because I think that was when I was kind of in the heights of like we were feeling it, and we were just like people were sending these memes, and you're just like I don't know what to do, and I was like, oh, someone, okay, there's some jokes here, cool, because that's how I resort to like panic.
Yeah.
Whenever it's like something's too serious or something is really hard, I'm like, where's the jokes? Where's the stuff? Which is why
Yeah.
during 2020, my Halloween costume was literally being 2020. I like had makeup all over and I had like toilet paper in my hand, and people were like, I don't get it. I was like, you would have gotten it next year.
Yeah.
And sure enough, that following year, a bunch of people started
Everyone was
dressing up as
2020.
2020. And I was like, y'all, I started that trend. But it is something that you do look back on when you've been able to kind of analyze where the burnout kind of started. It wasn't last week, last month, last year. Like you're like, oh, I've been here for a while.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And that I think that what we that tend to do, we don't go, okay, let me start working on my boundary. We start to blame ourselves. We do start
Yeah.
pointing the finger at somebody else and say, why didn't you see this? And I think there is when it comes to burnout, I do think that there is this level of shame that we carry that's like, I
Oh,
should have
yeah.
foreseen this. So to the person who might be feeling, because like I had a conversation I think like a month and a half ago with somebody, and they were just like, am I the only one who feels this? Am I just not the person who's supposed to be in this field? Am I like we go through all of this spiral of self-doubt? How can we sit with someone in that and just kind of help break that just a little bit to say like, friend, this is not that you're not supposed to be here, but you do need to kind of you need to do some self-care. Like I literally had to tell my friend
Yeah.
like, hey girl, go to a painting class, and I said, and you're not allowed to lead it. And she's like, shoot. I was like, you're not allowed to be the person in charge. And she's like,
Yeah.
that was literally what I was thinking I was going to go do. And I was like, no, you get to be the participant, because
Yeah.
every aspect that you're doing, you're leading in, and every aspect you become a mentor in. And she's like, I didn't even recognize that this, and this were all me literally being put into leadership roles accidentally. and
Yeah.
and I'm like, okay, so now you get to go to something where there's no possibility for mentoring. Don't listen to anybody, put AirPods in, and just paint with someone else
Yeah.
showing you how to do it. So what would you advise, like in the level that you've seen it in? How would we start walking someone to like, hey, it's time to get out of burnout?
Yeah. I mean, point out the issue. So, I mean, there's something that's kind of unique to American culture. Like if you evaluate every other culture in the world, it's like this like community culture, right? Like you have
Mm-hmm.
Spanish, you have flamenco, you have tapas, you have like it's all of a community thing, right? Like
Right.
Argentina, you sit around with mate drinking this tea that they have, right? Every culture is very much a community culture. America is if you've ever seen, there's this old advertisement called the Marlboro Man, who's this guy, he's a cowboy on a horse going through
Oh
the middle of nowhere
yeah.
smoking a cigarette, right? Like that's the quintessential American culture
That's so
of
good.
I'm self-sufficient. I have everything that I
Yeah.
need in and of myself. I don't
I don't
need
need
anyone.
anybody.
I am the
Mm.
hero of my story. And that is distinctly, I mean,
And
if you
build
want
an
to bring it into
addiction.
more
That's fine.
modern, yeah. Well,
That's really
if you want to build it into more modern terms, it's the
yeah.
diners, drives, and drive-ins and diners, drive-ins and dives guy, where he gets in his car, he drives across America, exploring. It's literally the same thing. It's American culture. So
Yeah.
identifying that American culture is I don't need anyone, I am self-sufficient, and
I
saying
know everything. I don't need
that's
help.
not
Yep.
healthy. So pointing out that that's
No.
not healthy, and that's an American. That's a really negative part of our culture. Other
Yeah.
around the world, that's not like that. Like you rely
Yeah.
on people. You need people. So identifying that it's something that has been put into you from the beginning of your life if you're an
Yeah.
American. Like
Yeah.
and that's not healthy. So kind of sort of dismantling that stuff that's been way in your past and saying, so listen, you need people, and that's
Yeah.
okay. If you were living in another country, no one would balk at you, asking for help or going and not
Yeah.
being the hero, right?
Yeah.
So just addressing that, I think is the biggest thing. I think we don't see it. Like we think that that's the
Mm.
way things are supposed to be because it's so ingrained in our culture, realizing it was never designed to be that way.
No. And I keep thinking of the conversations that I've had, and two things are pretty consistent is I don't have anybody that does what I do, which is I know for me that that's true. Not true. It's harder to find people that do what I do specifically.
Yeah,
There are very few who have been open to like a collaborative relationship, and that's something that I'm like, I'm going to help change this by being someone who's open, because it's been
yeah,
isolating and lonely. But
yeah,
then the second issue that I've seen is the relationship is not there for someone to call it out and say, friend, I see you. So
yeah,
that plays a part into someone receiving that message. But if you are a friend of someone watching them burn out, if you're a friend of a pastor or a worship leader or someone who's an advocate, and you're just like, yeah, I see him spiraling, I just don't know what to do, just have the conversation and say, like, friend, like, I know I don't do what you do, but what I'm starting to see is that you're no longer passionate about the things that you actually want to do. And I'm noticing you're
yeah,
going down to some routes that look a little weird or shady,
yeah,
or just being the person who says, like, because I love you, I want to make sure you're okay. And that person might be like, yeah, I'm fine, and just like leave. But being the person to kind of hopefully interrupt that spiral that they might be having of like pushing it off because they're self-doubting, just being able to say, hey, like, I do see you, because it is, you do, I
yeah,
when you said like you see it in their eyes, you see them like it is just what it is, and then like they just move on. I'm like, man, I've been in so many of those conversations with somebody, and it is usually the person that I'm like, something's happening, I just can't point it out.
yeah.
And I
I
do see that a lot.
I think that comes down to, I mean, I think about, whenever my wife and I had a baby and someone's like, can we bring you anything? My instinct is to say no, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can I bring you something?
Mm-hmm.
No. And then they're never going to ask again. But
Yeah.
instead, someone says, hey, I want to bring you a meal. What would you like to have? And they're like, give me three options. I'm like, okay, I'll take
Yeah,
meatloaf or whatever, right?
simplify it.
So,
Yeah.
and the idea is, yeah, it's kind of being a pest a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
they're not, that first conversation, they're not going to admit that anything's wrong, right? They're not going to admit they
Yeah,
need help. They'll be
might
like,
be five
hey, are
six
you struggling?
conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, you okay? I mean, I feel like, okay, no, well, hey, I want to talk to you, so I'm going to keep reaching out to you. I'm going to keep bugging you, and you keep hounding them
Yeah.
because I think that's the big thing is by the time that they actually like, because then someone asks, do you need anything? And I say no, and then about 2 hours later, I'm like, oh man, I could have actually used this, but I don't want to ask for that because I already said no, and they're probably already moved on. They probably didn't want to help me in the first place. They were just being
Yeah.
nice. So I justify myself out of actually asking for help. And I think it's the same thing when we're struggling in life.
100%. And I like that you said, can I bring you something? Do you need this, or this? Because I think
I
so
want to
many
bring you
times
something,
I want to
not
bring you
can I?
something.
Yeah.
I want to bring you something. I want to provide dinner. Like, be specific,
You almost
because I
make it like
think,
it's you're doing a favor to me, which makes them
yeah,
be the helper.
It's like what night, like I asked a friend because my one of my friends is a single dad and he's a foster dad, and I learned that with him that I could say what night this week or next week do you need dinner, and like ask specifically what night
Hmm.
do you need it.
Yeah.
And that started to like, he was like, thank you. And I was like, it's fine, like I just want to know what night, instead of can I send you something, do you need anything, because
Do you
we're in
need
different
anything? Yeah.
states, like what can I do, like, and he's not, he's not going to be rude and be like, well, what can you do, you live over here, I live over here. But that
Yeah.
is the reality, is that when we often say, do you need anything, it's a yes or no question,
Hmm.
answer to our question. But if we say, can't I want to do this for you, what night do you need it, here are your three options of what I can send, that helps the person kind of go, okay, that's what you mean, like, because usually if someone says, do you need anything, I'm like, you're just asking to ask. It's kind of like when you say, how are you at
Yeah.
church, how are you, you don't
Yeah.
actually want to know. And I've actually had to be like, do you want to know or do you want to just
Yeah.
do the pass by hi? And someone was like, I want to do the pass by hi. I was like, cool, bye. Like, it's fine. But that's the reality, is that sometimes in our being overwhelmed, being in the burnout, we don't know what we really need. And
Yeah.
we can identify something's wrong internally, but we don't want to speak that out to people. Whatever, I know for myself, it's like I don't want to say like, hey, I'm burned out, but it's the burnout comes through, it comes out in the way I speak, the way that I hold myself,
Yeah.
the way I show up. I'm usually ending up being late, looking a mess, feeling a mess, and then just being like, I don't know what you want me to tell you. I'm like, that's not a good place to be. And my pastor friend last year, it actually popped up and I was like, that's actually kind of funny. He was like, Denisha, I've known you since you were 13, and last year I was just turned 34. And he goes, I know you can't physically rest and take time off, but what does rest look like in this next year? And I was like, I don't know. And my husband's like, what would happen if you rested? Like, and that was such a hard question to answer, because it was
Hmm.
like, I don't know. And I'm like, we'll lose everything. He's like, no, we won't. But it
Yeah.
was that question that I needed, was like, what bad would happen if you actually rested and took
Yeah.
days to where you did just little things, where it's like, okay, you aren't, because I work from home, I teach from home, I do everything from my house. And literally, like, I'll be like, wow, it's been 2 weeks, haven't gone out, haven't changed, haven't showered, like, that's gross. And that's how I know, like, I'm like, oh, I'm in it. And you don't, like, sometimes you just wake up into it. And so this is
Yeah.
where I was in that season where I was like, I'm in it, like, I'm in it hard. And you asking me what would happen if I rested, I don't know what that answer looks like for me. And that sometimes it took a while, like it took like 6 months to get to that. But it was because people are just like, instead of how are you, it was like, when was the last time that you rested? When was the last time you took a day
Yeah.
off? And those things were like, wow, really haven't, okay, I need to go do something. And it was like, sometimes it is just shower and change. And then other times it's like, you need to get out of the house and you
Yeah.
need to go have fun and unplug and turn your phone off. But that it has taken a solid year, and getting back into therapy was huge for me. Um, the last year of sitting with her, with my therapist, and being like, okay, this is what I'm feeling. And I literally, it was in December, and I was like, she's like, so what brings you in? And I was like, I'm super jaded. Like that's what brings me in. Like, I am just, there's something going on. And she's just like, and I just told her, I was like, I feel emotionally, mentally, physically exhausted. And it feels, as we identified it like a couple months in, she's like, you say this, but it's not a physical exhaustion for you, it's a deeper emotional exhaustion. And it's taken a year to like start to feel that I'm out of that, where I'm like, wow, that was really bad, that was really
Yeah.
dark, that was really hard. And I think there's times that I'm so grateful for the people around me, because it's like, I'm like, man, I wish I was out of it sooner. And they're just like, hey, like, we don't beat ourselves up, we
Yeah.
recognized it. But I am starting to see that in other people too. So when it comes to finding someone for therapy, what is your advice on that? Should it be internal to where we go to church? Should it be outside of church? Should it be someone who's cheap? Should it be someone who's not cheap? Like, what, let's talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a trial and error process of finding
Yeah.
someone that, understands you, that isn't trying to give you quick answers.
Mm.
I've
Or
been to
quick
therapists that,
fixes. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I've been to
Mm-hmm.
therapists, and I tell them what I'm dealing with. They're like, "Have you tried this?" And I'm like, "That's, can we like,
Did
can
I
we dive into
try
my
this?
life?"
Did
Yeah,
you
or
not
I'm like,
listen to me?
okay, I'll try it. But I'm like, I don't think that it's a simple, like, this is going to suddenly like
It's
break the
not.
pattern. Like the
Yeah.
reason I'm coming to a therapist is because I feel like there's a pattern I want to dismantle.
Yeah.
And you're trying to give me a quick fix. So yeah, it's trying to figure out that right person for
Like, did
you.
you try
Um,
Jesus? What? I've heard that. And I'm like,
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's,
I'm like,
did have
yes,
you
I
had,
have.
how's your faith? Yeah. But so it's finding someone that jives with you, and then finding
Yeah.
someone. I think the biggest thing is, even if you're not necessarily going to get a counselor, finding someone who if you displease them, you aren't going to get punished.
Ooh.
Meaning, I think a lot of times we're like we talk to an authority in our life, and that authority is,
Mm.
if we tell them the wrong thing, I'm going to lose my job, or they're going to
Yeah.
know the thing. So finding someone who doesn't have skin in the game, who can actually objectively listen to you and just say, okay, this is really jacked up.
Yeah.
There's no consequences for that, but that's really jacked up. Like, let's
And
talk
I
about it.
I think that's where, so if you're a pastor, I don't think going to an internal house of counseling is a good idea.
To an elder, yeah, to someone on the staff,
Elder,
or someone
like,
who,
go
yeah,
to an outside resource, to someone who, I at this point you can decide if it's a Christian counselor or not, or therapist, but also trauma informed, because as a pastor or someone who's in ministry, you're dealing with a lot of trauma. You're dealing with secondhand trauma. You could be
yeah,
re-traumatized. Maybe you grew up in a hard, like, had a hard life, and now people who are around you are also experiencing that. But you really are carrying a lot of people's stuff that you don't want to sit with someone and they're like, well, did you try prayer? And it's like, okay,
yeah,
so pastor here, or like minister here, pray all the time, like, I'm a Christian, like,
yeah,
prayer does work, but here's the issue, is that we have, just like, it's the mask all, and it's like, okay, there, like you said, there's a pattern that's happening. It's like, yes, I'm praying, yes, I'm going to church, but the problem is there's something happening in a pattern in me that is, this is not helping at this point.
well, and
And that's
that
hard,
that might actually be what needs to fix it, but
right?
sometimes you
There's
need the
they're the
empathy
extra,
element first to
yes,
say, okay, you are getting what I'm talking about, but yeah, I have been slacking on prayer. And I think that's
yeah,
probably the biggest thing, is finding a counselor that has empathy and is actually
yes.
hearing you instead of directing you to those quick fixes. And that's probably, again, I think I
And
keep going back to empathy.
there's such a hard part where it's like, I've watched it through a few friends who are pastors, where it's like, we asked that question, like, when was the last time you prayed? And it's like, oh, I pray all the time. It's like, no, 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 no. Like, when's the
Yeah,
last time you prayed? Not for
yeah,
all the other stuff that you have to pray for, not for, I watch you pray for others' behalf, but like, when did you sit and just be like, Lord, I'm tired,
yeah,
I'm done. And then it's like, oh, well, and it's like that's the level of where you need your therapist to get to, is like, okay, no, not for your congregation, not for all this other stuff, not on Sunday. When have you
yeah,
prayed where you sat and you're like, Lord, this is how I felt? And even my therapist did that. I'm like, I pray all the time. I'm always talking to God. I'm always listening to worship. And she's like, no, 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 Denisha. And I was like, huh? Oh, dang. And that's where it was like, prayer works. Prayer is our solution, but there is a difference between just talking and just doing the action, and actually
yeah,
like feeling the action. And that's that empathy piece that you were like, hey, this might be missing, is that you have someone say, what you feel is valid, what you
yeah.
feel is real. It's not, you're not making this a big deal, but now let's go deeper here. Let's go to a deeper level. So last question, where can we find your book?
Yeah,
And I'm going to plug
on
you everywhere.
Amazon, I think on Spotify now you can listen to it. I think they give you like 14 hours of free listening per
Hey.
month of an audiobook. Obviously on Audible, but yeah, anywhere books are sold. So
Oh, I love that. And say the name of again of the book.
it's called Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright.
I love it. Is there anything else you would like to add before we end?
No, yeah, I
Kind
mean
of
I
an
think
abrupt
that's
end.
yeah, I think
I was like, sorry. I don't know
there's
how to
many
end
things that I was thinking about
conversation.
saying, but
Go
I never
ahead.
wanted to interrupt you. So
Yeah, go ahead. Say
um
whatever else you want. We have time.
I just don't remember. I don't remember what it was.
Oh no. He's gonna be like, after, be like, ah. So I have this
Okay,
really,
this was it. This was it.
go.
This was it. Understanding this was revolutionary in my life.
Hmm.
Understanding that leisure time has similar importance to work. That actually rest, you should schedule rest just like
Mm.
you schedule a meeting, and that is a good use of your time.
Okay.
Because whenever people, if you don't know how to say no, it's because someone says, hey, do you have time to help me? And the answer is always yes, if you don't think that rest is something important. But if you say, nope, I got rest scheduled for 2 hours, it's just as important as this recording this podcast, I
Yeah.
am going to rest at that time. I can reschedule it if I need to, if it's really important, but I'm going to schedule that rest. It's
Okay.
okay to schedule rest.
Block it out as rest though. Like, don't just put block, because I have seen people, you're calling me out because I'll just put block,
Yeah,
and people have access to my calendar. And it used to be a thing where
it's
people
empty
were just,
space. Yeah.
it, it's empty. So if you put rest, there's someone said something to me is like, Denisha, if you don't block it, it doesn't happen. And I was
Call
like,
it something different. Call it like doctor's appointment or something.
do
Use a
something like,
code word for yourself
come
if you
hang
need
out with
to. But
me if you
yeah,
need to, where it's just like we sit on a Zoom for 2 hours. I'm a doctor, so now you can say you have a doctor's appointment and not have to lie. There you go. But it's somebody else had said something where it's like, be careful with saying, if it's really important, I can move it, because people will always try to move it for you because they do think it's
yeah,
important. So it's like,
yeah,
determine up front when you're not in the conversation, what would you consider important, but also be okay to say, I have this availability tomorrow. Like, let's meet tomorrow. Because
yeah,
9 times out of 10, when I'm in that thick of burnout, and I'm like, dude, like, it almost is never where I, like, when I fit someone in, I'm always like, no, that didn't, I shouldn't have done that. Like,
yeah.
no, like, that shouldn't happen. So I actually started blocking out. I don't do Zoom sessions on Monday, half of Wednesday, and Fridays anymore, because I was literally doing Zoom sessions every single day. And then all of a
Mm,
sudden I wasn't putting my other activities in, and I would be like, why do I get to Saturday and I just like have no motivation to do anything? And I kept going, you're lazy, you're lazy, you're lazy. And
yeah.
I talked to someone else, people can listen to the episode, but Mac Brock talked about like how to build relationships, and he talked about calendaring. And one of the things he said is like, don't just look at your free day, look at your week. And I was like, why is this revolutionary? And I'm a planner. Like, this is plan A personality here. And what I did that week is like, I looked at my week. I had 14 Zoom calls. I had 15 assignments that I got done. I did grading and I did all this other stuff while my daughter wasn't sleeping through the night. And I was like, no wonder why Saturday was a crash day. Like, my body's like,
Yeah,
we're not, my brain was like, get done, girl. Like, we're done. We're not doing this
yeah,
anymore. I don't know why that, like, my New York Bronx accent came out or whatever. But I love that you said that, because if we don't plan for it, it's not going to happen. But block it
yeah.
out. Doctor's appointment, rest. If someone is struggling with moving the stuff over, who can they ask for, like, who should they ask for accountability from, to not just keep moving that time?
Um, someone who cares about you, a spouse, a family member, a parent, a sibling, a close
Mm.
friend, that give them access to your calendar. And if something changes, like let it ping. I mean, it's almost like those. My wife did this like fitness thing where she had to like take a screenshot of the thing. She had to log all of her food, and she had to
Mm.
send a screenshot to
Yeah.
her nutritionist, right? And that nutritionist would look at everything and be like, "Why did you eat that?" And it wasn't like to shame her, but it was
Yeah.
just like,
I'm like,
I'm it's okay.
it's
It's
for
okay to
accountability.
it's an accountability thing. And so having someone who cares and who actually will check over you, not as like a police, but as like I need this. I need this for myself. So please do this for me.
Well, and the nutritionist is asking, what's wild to me is like, I used to be like, oh no, and I made a face when I was like, oh, you do not want to see my eating habit. But what chimed into my head was the nutritionist is doing it to say, okay, what's happening? Because I noticed
Yeah.
maybe there's a window where it's like, hey, kind of every day at 3 to 4, you
Yeah.
binge eat. Like, you ate
Or you're
so much
hungry.
right
You're not
here.
eating enough of the good stuff that
And
you're
that's
eating
what
something
they
bad. So
might
let's
find,
up your, yeah.
100%. And it might be like, okay, so 3 to 4, you're overeating. Let's up this in the morning. But also, it's like, what's happening at 3 to 4?
Yeah.
And it might be like, hey, I that's when I pick up my kids from school and I'm emotional and it's stressful. And, or it's like, I have a certain client at 2 o'clock and then I'm always eating after because I'm stressed. So the person who's keeping you accountable is not doing it to attack you, but to say, like,
Yeah.
hey, why, I see that you keep moving, rest. What's going on?
Yeah.
Okay,
Exactly.
during that rest time, we are going to sit down for a 2 hour meeting, and I'm going to sit with you, and we're going to read a
Yeah.
book. We're going to put worship on. We're just going to sit together. And that, like, it makes me a little bit of like more emotional. I don't know why, but I'm like, I'm feeling it, like, wow, like, there's someone going to listen to this who's going to go, oh shoot, I'm in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And they're going to go, I don't have anybody to sit with me for that. So how can they find someone? Because maybe they're in a situation they don't have it. Where would you ask them to look first? And then
It's a good
I mean,
question.
I'm gonna find some resources for free counseling and
Yeah.
things like that, or counseling, and plug this into the captions. But where should they look first if they don't have a spouse, or maybe how can they approach that situation and conversation with someone, maybe a spouse or someone else that they trust?
I would probably make it a pattern in your life to go to small group church settings, not just small groups. Like, so like if you go to a large church of 1,000 people, it's gonna be really hard to find that.
Yeah,
Um, Maybe go to a church of 100 people or less, that those
yeah,
people are like very much invested in their lives. If you're in that 1,000 member church, go to a small young adults group, go to three small groups, but find the relationships, find that one person that like your little like friend radar goes off and says, that person might get me.
yeah,
And then humble yourself and be willing to look like, feel you're gonna feel like an idiot to be like,
yeah.
hey, so would you be down to hang out and grab coffee? Like, I don't have any really cool friends, and you seem really cool. Like, there's a
Mm.
lifelong friend I have who I just went to his like Air Force retirement thing, but
Oh,
like
that's
that's how he
cool.
approached me. I was like leading worship one Sunday, and he's like, dude, I just moved here, and like you look really cool. I think I'd like you to be my friend. And like I was in college, and I'm like, you don't do that. Like you don't
Yeah,
do that.
yeah,
But the lack of guile in the way he did that, I was like, all right, let's be friends. Let's grab coffee.
yeah.
And then the lifelong friendship started. But he humbled himself enough to say, like,
Mm.
hey, I need friends, and you look like someone to be a cool friend.
So you said something, so I've done that in a large church setting and was met with rejection.
Hmm.
So that was really hard because it was multiple
Yeah,
times. But what I think the key is where you're like, hey, go then find a small church
yeah.
or a small group
Not to hate
somewhere.
on big churches or
No,
anything,
no,
but the
no.
idea of
But
the
yes,
smallness is like you've already kind of established, if you're in that small setting, I want to have that type of relationship.
people, it's a different set, because even if it's just a small group that you go to, like, you're
Yeah,
not trying to reach into, like, what you we began with is like you're trying to reach into this mass crowd of 100,000 people. We're not meant to connect on that level. So if we
yeah,
find a Bible study, maybe our church doesn't have any, so we find a local one, or a
yeah,
Celebrate Recovery group where it's like people are
yeah,
there intentionally, they're saying, I want to go deeper, I want to have
yeah,
friendship, I want to have accountability. So you're stepping into an environment that's intentionally smaller and saying, I'm here to be present. And for someone who might
yeah.
be a pastor or an advocate in a space, stepping outside of your community could help with that, because you might
Oh,
feel,
yeah,
you in your, I'm going to be honest, pastors can't do this in their own community because people go, pastors here, let me talk to them, and it's like, it
yeah,
doesn't work, it just doesn't work for you, friends. Like, you got to go to a different group. Like, I love you, so
yeah,
sorry, it happens. But there are people who are, it's going to be more of like, I need from you, versus going to somewhere where you're not known and sitting with people
yeah.
who don't know you. I mean, don't say you're a pastor, like, be okay with that,
Exactly.
and just say, I'm just here. Like,
Yeah,
I've had to do that as like, don't say you're an advocate, don't say you're a doctor, don't say you're a professor, like, don't try to be the leader. Like, sit
yeah,
back. And that's the hardest thing to do sometimes, but just sit back and just be like, I'm here to work on some things. I want a community. And I think that's where I didn't try that before. And that was hard because it was like, well,
hmm,
got rejected. Like, never again.
yeah.
Turning Kelly Clarkson, I'm like, never again. But do you have anything else you would, this is such a good conversation, I'm going to have so many questions, but do you have anything else you would like to add before we end?
No, I think that was the main one.
I
I
love
felt
that.
the passion to say
I'm so
scheduling
glad you
rest. I think
did.
it's huge.
Yes, I love that, because that's something I was like, when I love thinking through, I'm like, I don't have rest in my calendar, and I have blackout dates, but I need to actually have that solid. It's like I had to plug my lunch hour in, guys. Like, this is the level of detail you have to get to in your calendar sometimes when you're not doing things and passing out because you're like, I didn't eat, or just feeling sick. So
Yeah,
plan your rest, find people for accountability. We don't end up on burnout on accident. It is not
yeah,
accidental. And I think that's the hardest realization, is going, so let's not burn out. Let's burn bright. Get Jonathan's book. And who you said there was a second author with that, correct?
yeah. His name's Jason Young. I mean, we
Jason
write
Young.
all our
Love
books
it.
together. He's a solid guy.
Follow both of them on social media. Though the reels are lit, as the young old kids say. We don't say
As the
that term anymore.
older young kids
We're
said,
fine.
yeah.
We say Rufus still from like the 90s. But thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining me. This was amazing. I personally learned a lot of where I'm like, oh, that's gonna help me going forward. And we're just remember, you guys, like it's one step at a time. Like don't try to do all of it at once, because I think that's where
Yeah.
we really do stop. Is well, I tried it doesn't work. One thing at a time. If it's just blocking out rest, if it's just getting into therapy, if it's just finding someone to be honest and real with, if it's just finding someone who can be empathetic with us, that's one step at a time. If it's just getting Jonathan's book or taking the quiz, just to see where you're at, I think would be a phenomenal thing for you guys to do. Thank you again so much, Jonathan, and we hope you all have a good day.
Yeah.
Bye. All right.